Pillars of Eternity 2 has made an admirable effort to improve on the shortcomings of its predecessor in a number of ways. Unfortunately, it's let down in one of the most important areas for this type of game, its story and writing. Worse than this though is the amount of bugs and balance issues in the game at launch. Some bugs should always be expected in a big RPG on release, but this game's really not in a good state. The biggest problem is after a certain point, about a third of the way through the game, difficulty feels non-existent even on the hardest setting, and the overall experience is severely limited as a result. While I want to get into exactly what is wrong with the difficulty and look at some of the major bugs, before that it's worth noting some of the bigger changes from the first Pillars of Eternity, because a lot has been improved and added. Firstly, the graphics have got an upgrade that mostly looks great. Mostly. The clearest improvements are the quality of models and the lighting. Things look much better zoomed in. Some environments can look fantastic. If there's one area where the graphics really shine, it's in dungeons. They're dark and atmospheric and really make you appreciate how much better the lighting and shadows are now. Not everything is looking good though. For some reason the ground textures can look off, particularly mud and grass, which sometimes looks jarringly bad. Sometimes urban areas can look a bit weird too, like the water here or this river. The game looks a little different in general. It looks less like the high quality pre-renders of the first Pillars and more like the world is made of actual in-game models. It can make it look a little less nostalgic, in some ways. Still, overall the graphics are much improved, and these are seriously some of the best looking dungeons I've ever adventured through in an RPG. One of the other big changes you'll notice quickly is voice acting.
Aora. A world where mortals live, die, and are reborn through the turning of the wheel.
The first game had voice acting for important conversations, but not in the majority of dialogue. And in a game with a lot of text, that means there's a lot you'll need to read yourself. This game is almost completely voice acted. There were like 1 or 2 NPCs out of hundreds I spoke to in the entire game that had actual dialogue but no voice acting, which was a bit weird, but all of the rest are fully voiced. The choose your own adventure sections are not, and there are way more of these now. But still, there's so much dialogue in this game that the sheer amount of voice acting is pretty impressive, and must have cost Obsidian a lot of money. I know for loads of people voice acting is really important, and so this will be a welcome change for them. And I don't want to be too negative on this subject because I recognise voice acting is important to many people. There are a few reasons why I don't think this adds all that much to the experience, however. Firstly, voice acting is so much slower than reading. This game has huge amounts of dialogue, so the time it takes adds up. If you listen to all of the dialogue as opposed to just reading, that adds hours to the playtime that could have been spent doing other things. Reading ahead while listening to voice acting feels kind of awkward as well. I think voice acting can add a huge amount to storytelling in games, particularly in certain examples. It adds personality and emotion, and that's true in this kind of RPG too, but there's also nothing to support the voice acting. Other games have something to look at. They have facial animations, and scenes can come across as directed through changes in camera angle or lighting, making the whole thing feel more cinematic and engaging. You don't get any of that with a text box though, you're just listening to a voice, and by comparison it's a bit boring when there's so much dialogue to just sit and listen without anything going on screen. Of course, voice acting doesn't make dialogue worse, even if it is annoyingly slow at times. So it's not a negative, but the point I'm trying to make is, it doesn't add all that much, and it's worth noting because of the cost. I don't know exactly how expensive it is, and it's never easy to say, spending this much money on thing A is a waste, and it should have been put towards thing B, because it's always a bit more complex than that. But I do think having this much voice acting may have been a waste. When you consider how many bugs there are and how rushed the game can feel in some ways, you have to at least wonder if money couldn't have been better spent. I think voice acting could have been limited to story quests, faction quests, companion-related conversations, and a few of the bigger side quests, and then not used for smaller subquests and unimportant NPCs, and I don't think much would have been lost. The voice acting itself's okay, just get used to lots of Italian accents. Sometimes some of the other accents could be a little much.
It eases my pain. More than that is an awful long yarn, and nae tad lickly.
And sometimes an accent can sound a bit off.
Care for a fish or two, stranger? Today's catch, ripped straight from the hands of the Soulry Witch.
I did like how one NPC, whose Italian accent was clearly not good and seemed to have heavy English undertones, actually had a dialogue option and an in-game explanation for why that is. It made a nice surprise to see that inclusion straight after thinking to myself, man, her accent's bad. So the voice acting's not all great, but the overall quality is still high. I'm not sure how to feel about all new big parts being given to members of Critical Role. On the one hand, I recognise they're all respected voice actors, and there's even an argument that could be made that their inclusion might make some Critical Role fans happy, which is not worthless. On the other hand, I don't like the idea that people might be given parts on the basis of their e-celeb status, as opposed to their suitability for the role, and I feel that may have played a part in their selection. The narrator sounded miscast to me, but that could be personal taste, I guess. Jyoti's accent sounded off, although I'm not sure if that's the fault of a voice actor maybe being forced to do an accent they're not comfortable with, or just the heavy southern US accent feels out of place in the setting. Either way, it felt a little distracting. Seraphine's voice didn't seem to quite fit his character, although performance-wise there was no issue. Overall, the performance of new characters is fine, so I can't criticise it too much. It just seems a slightly questionable practice to me. As a marketing decision, it seems pretty pointless though. I don't think many people buy a game based off having a voice actor they like, and I don't think it raises much public awareness for the game, as I'd guess the sorts of people who watch Critical Role would be quite likely to hear about the game anyway. Gameplay wise, there are a few big changes. The largest is the overworld and ship management. The overworld itself is an interesting addition. It gives the player far more freedom to explore. It also makes the world you explore seem more immersive and make the player feel more connected to locations by providing a sense of scale and player agency when travelling. When compared to statically moving from one set location to the next, I think it's vastly preferable, although I may have a big soft spot for overworlds because I do often wish they were used more often. What you do in the overworld is nothing special. You can gather basic resources, which aren't worth much, and explore locations for loot at the cost of in-game time, which is something with so low a cost it's not really worth considering. The more substantial parts of the overworld are non-random storybook style events, as well as single fights and dungeons. The set fights are preceded by a text section that gives a description of a location while also providing a few options for scouting what's ahead or calling out to whoever's out there to try and engage them in conversation. These kind of set the scene, but after around 10, the preceding text seems a bit boring, and by the end of the game I'd skipped reading them to just get to the fight quicker. The fights take place on a few small repeated maps, making them feel like filler content, which is exactly what they are, but it's the kind of filler that makes sense. There is maybe a few too many of them for players who want to explore everywhere, as the game's long enough to not need any extra padding. Each fight tends to reward you with one item of interesting loot, as well as your typical vendor trash, which is enough to stop them just feeling like a waste of the player's time though. The dungeons are more worthwhile. There's a lot of variety and some really interesting locations. They each have at least something in the way of story to make them more than just a place to enter, kill and loot. I think they succeed at making the player feel like an explorer delving into forgotten corners of the world. The only big problem they have is as actual dungeons, they're disappointing. Almost all are just single floor areas with one or two fights which you'll be in and out of in less than 15 minutes. This is probably intentional because one criticism the devs said they wanted to address was how combat heavy parts of the last game felt. I miss the big dungeons though. There's something nice about getting to the end of a long dungeon and feeling like you've had to work for your rewards, and getting that feeling of relief when it's finally over. I don't mean like the endless paths of Old Newer length, just a normal 3-level dungeon that takes an hour or two. The first pillars may have had too many of these that caused pacing problems, but I think having some is a good thing. Not all dungeons in Deadfire are the 1 or 2 fight variety, but it only has one good example of a really longer dungeon, and while that example is fantastic and I'll mention it later, I think a few more of these would have been a big plus. Lastly, there's the storybook events that take place in the overworld. These are usually completely insignificant, with often nothing at all happening as a result, but I like them a lot anyway. Things like meeting some followers of Whale, or entering a swimming contest with some local Juana, added to making the world feel like a real place. And while both of the examples I mentioned were completely pointless from a gameplay perspective, I'm glad they exist anyway. They provide a more natural form of world building than, say, the lore dumps of the first pillars. Of course, a big part of travelling the world map is done on ship. This is the game's most marketable new feature. Everyone wants to be a pirate, right? Pirates are still popular, I guess? I mean, Obsidian certainly thinks so with how much they talked about the new ship features pre-release. If all you care about is being a pirate though, you might be a bit disappointed. you're really just a pirate in name alone. The only pirate-like activity you do is fight other ships, which gives some good coin but has no actual consequences on factions or the world. The ship fighting itself is bad. If you're expecting something fun or deep from combat, you're going to be disappointed because it's neither. Its worst sin is it's so slow, and combined with its simplicity, the whole thing just gets really boring. The good news is, if you know what you're doing, you can get through it painlessly. Just spam 1 like this. Just spam away and you'll take almost no damage and get straight to actual combat. You can even board without ramming if you pay attention, but why bother paying attention? When you do catch up, you'll enter a normal fight. It's stupid how the number of enemies you fight doesn't decrease if you kill enemy crew with cannons beforehand, but you probably won't bother doing that in most cases anyway. The fight itself is kinda nice. All your companions join in, making it a pretty large scale affair. Just be prepared for some frame drops. I think there might be a reason the number of party members decreased from 6 to 5 that I don't actually think has anything to do with 6 being too much for the player to manage. The engine, on the other hand, seems to struggle at times. Anyway, it's a shame the text-based ship combat isn't good, or that there aren't many other options like parleying, but at least the text section can be largely skipped, if you know how. The other side of being a captain of the seas is resource and crew management. This may have been a fun addition, except the resources are also cheap and easy to get hold of. It's made completely pointless after your first voyage. Ship morale is even worse. With almost zero effort, it will be full the entire time. So much for mutinies or any kind of interesting captain roleplaying. Your crew seem to be over the moon just to have you in their presence, so long as you don't literally starve them. Collecting and leveling up your crew is also pointless, as ship combat is something you can skip, and I'm not even sure what some of the ship roles do, but whatever it isn't much. That said, I really enjoyed collecting crew members around the world on my travels. I love Worthless Idiot. You may have been worthless to Archimir, but you're not worthless to me, buddy, and I'm going to show you the world.
A worthless idiot stays in crow's nest. Eat crows for captain. I join crew.
And hey, the cook may be a cannibal, but we all have to start learning somewhere. Passion and resourcefulness are the most important parts of cooking anyway, I think. Another hyped up feature pre-release was multiclassing, and it is what it says, and it's definitely a great addition. It adds a lot of new options and allows the player to make some really unique feeling builds. Of course, different builds won't be balanced, and they don't need to be. Sacrificing some balance in favour of freedom is worth it. As far as multi-class versus single-class balance, I'm not sure exactly, but it doesn't seem too bad. Locking off the last 2 ability tiers at least seems a fair compromise. Some multi-class combos are likely very overpowered, but I think that's a pretty small problem compared to the far bigger problems we'll get to soon. Party AI is also new. This seems like a response to those who complained that micromanaging in the first game was tedious, and so it's an attempt to make the game appeal to a broader audience. I don't mind micromanagement, and I'm not that audience, so I can't speak on how well it achieves that goal. It's not a core part of gameplay like, say, Final Fantasy XII. It's more like an option to turn gameplay off, or to turn it into a hands-off affair where you only use a few key abilities while letting your party take care of themselves. It's an okay addition. The AI is pretty terrible at the game, although you can customize ability usage a bit. But this is a game where minuscule positional differences of spells or party members can have a huge impact, so the AI is never going to be that great. And while the AI may be terrible, that doesn't matter because Deadfire is currently so lacking in difficulty, the AI can easily steamroll most fights even on Path of the Damned with scaling upwards. This is the game's biggest issue, and it is a huge issue. Before talking about what's caused this, let me give you some perspective. I played the first Pillars on Veteran, and I found it suitably challenging but slightly too easy in the second half of the game from being overleveled. I played Deadfire on Path of the Damned with scaling on and only scaling upwards. Overall, it is far easier than the first game was on Veteran. The first third of the game was an appropriate difficulty, but after leaving Nekataka for the first time, I didn't find a single fight that had the slightest challenge for the rest of the game. I could win everything with AI. I could win almost everything with just auto-attacking. Some fights were over with a single unempowered spell from each of my casters, including endgame fights. To make it clear, I didn't min-max in the slightest. I didn't use any strong builds. My main was an illusionist, which in retrospect I think is a pretty weak class. I built companions based off what seemed fun or what fit them. I didn't look up anything about what things were strong or weak. I've since noticed a lot of people saying dual wielding's OP and two-handers suck. Well, I had no dual wielders. I used 3 party members with 2-handers and 2 with shields. I almost never used empowerments. I didn't use any items except some health potions at the start of the game. I don't consider myself great at these games. Better than average through past experience, sure, but that's it. There is no way I should have had such an easy time, and loads of people probably want an experience considerably harder than me, who will find this an even bigger problem. The problem of non-existent difficulty was so bad to me that the last 2/3 of the game were in many ways ruined. I love the gameplay of this genre, but with no challenge it feels entirely pointless. Why care about loot? Why care about what abilities you choose at level up? Why bother to even take time to use abilities when you can just turn the speed up and auto-attack? Part of this problem seems to be from an overall attempt to lower the difficulty. Perhaps normal was too hard for too many players before and changing it would have been appropriate. But there are plenty of easier difficulties and there's no reason to lower Path of the Damned. Most of this problem is to do with level scaling though. On paper it sounded fantastic, and it seems it really was too good to be true. Level scaling would have solved the difficulty problems of the first game. Of course, some people hate level scaling for making experience feel pointless, so Obsidian seemed to have wanted to please everyone with making scaling an option, but also allowing players to choose whether to scale things only up, and whether to scale everything or just the main story content. So everything is covered and this should have been an amazing feature. In practice it doesn't seem to work. Obsidian claim it's a bug, but it's hard to know exactly what's going on, whether too little content is affected or it scales by too small an amount, or a bug is making it scale incorrectly. Right now, as of me writing this, there is a beta patch that claims to address the problem. I haven't tested it myself, but some users claim that nothing is being scaled still, or that things only get scaled by 2 additional levels, which is not going to be enough to matter in most later game areas. A lot of people have defended Obsidian in regards to the difficulty problem, saying things like, it's just the result of a bug, bugs happen, or it will be fixed in time, you just gotta expect this stuff near launch. I have a big problem with this response for a number of reasons. Firstly, this isn't just one simple bug. If it was, it would have been fixed sooner, and even now I don't think the issue has been properly fixed. This is an important feature in the game that doesn't work at all at launch. Some people seem to think Obsidian can't have known about this, as some bugs can get overlooked. I don't think that's true. Just before release there were comments from Obsidian about Path of the Damned not being balanced yet, and I'm sure these comments were deliberately made in an attempt to preempt the criticism they knew was coming. This game was delayed once already. I think Obsidian were overconfident in thinking they had given themselves enough time to fix known issues with the second release date, and they were scared to delay the game again. So they shipped something they knew had huge issues, thinking they could get away with blaming it on bugs and fixing it later. This is bad practice. What's more, it's exactly the type of thing that shouldn't happen with crowd-funded games. Isn't that meant to be one of the main draws of Kickstarter games? No publisher to dictate release dates and force compromises that might benefit sales but hurt consumers? The blame is all on Obsidian here. I also don't accept the idea that this is something consumers who play at release should be expected to put up with. This isn't an early access game. You're meant to be being sold a finished product, and if it's not finished you're entitled to complain about it. Most people play games at release, and a lot of people only play a game once. It doesn't matter how well something may be fixed later if the experience you get is no good. People who buy a game at launch shouldn't be viewed as suckers who deserve a subpar game for being what? Eager? Loyal? A chunk of these players are backers. They deserve better, and Obsidian should know better. And this is not just the usual bugs you'd expect in a game like this, although they exist too. It's also not a balance issue. I don't expect this kind of RPG to be anywhere close to balanced, even years after release. This genre has always had terrible balance, with all sorts of overpowered aspects that can heavily be abused. It's not an issue with some classes or builds being too strong at all, it's a problem of difficulty just not existing. Even if level scaling was completely fixed, I still think much more balance would be needed. As far as I can tell, current armor and penetration systems would make for some really long fights later in the game if levels were scaled correctly, and it wouldn't be challenging so much as just very slow. Still, balance is not even worth thinking about with overall difficulty being so lacking. A more serious problem is how you can't increase the difficulty to Path of the Damned if you don't start on it, and also level scaling gets disabled on changing difficulty currently, both of which must make the problem of the game being too easy worse for people who don't start on Path of the Damned but do want to change things later. Some of the other bugs in the game right now are worth mentioning too. If you played the previous game, then when you start this one you'll probably be looking forward to importing your save. After getting out of character creation and having a chat with Adir, I was surprised as after asking him what he's been up to, he said the exact opposite of the ending I had just imported. After checking around, it seemed this was a bug affecting everyone. Even if you make a new custom endgame state, the Adir problem still existed. It's not the only import issue I encountered. Palagina's background was also wrong, and comments were made at times that suggested I return the souls to people's bodies in the last game, which I didn't. Bugs with importing are pretty painful. It was important to me what choices I made in the last game. This isn't my idea. There are lots of other bugs too. Retraining removes your watcher abilities for some reason, as well as any bought training passives which can't be bought again. NPCs also talk over each other sometimes, or over themselves in conversations.
You
I
imagine
pleased
that
about the
blood
Harappo
is
epic
easy to
resting in the
remove
hands
from
of those who
carpet.
lost it once before.
I invite you to clean up after yourself.
More annoying is a mouse issue that sometimes thinks a single click is a double click, and so when clicking through conversations, scenes would occasionally get skipped for me.
Brother, stand down.
And of course, then there's quest bugs. I had several of these, including one for a major faction quest that resulted from me doing one objective too early by accident, and also a similar issue with one companion quest. Luckily I found a way to solve it by slaughtering some innocent people to force the quest to update. One quest I couldn't kill my way out of was one of the bounty chains, where the NPC completely disappears from my game. While I don't need to finish every bounty, it's still frustrating, and other NPCs were disappearing in Nekataka as well, like some shopkeepers, making me wonder if this bug couldn't have easily been worse and affect more quests. In general, I think I'm quite forgiving with bugs. Particularly in a big game like this, you have to accept they exist. It comes down to two things: how much they harm the experience and how widespread are they. Well, in the case of the importing issue and level scaling, they're very widespread. And with the difficulty issues in general, I found they harm the experience greatly. I would forgive other bugs, but they support the idea that this game was not finished and it should not have been released this early. To their credit, Obsidian has a good track record of both fixing bugs and improving balance through post-launch support, and I'm sure that will continue with Deadfire. A lot of what I've complained about may be fixed in the future, but right now I'd recommend people to wait before playing it, because the game does badly need to be fixed, and there are more balance issues that I'll talk about later. The difficulty problem is a shame, because in other ways there have been improvements to gameplay. Fights are visually slightly clearer, and encounter designs better than the previous game. You sometimes have these swarm-style encounters where waves of enemies can create big positional problems for your party, and force you to react accordingly. Small doorways are less prevalent. Also, the noise system is interesting. You'll probably ignore it for much of a game, but having more enemies hear the fight and join in is still a nice inclusion. Overall, there's definitely a feeling that the developers wanted to reduce the amount of filler trash fights, while also making the encounters a bit more varied. Some other systems have been scrapped, and while there might have been good reasons, I'm still sad to see them go. The per encounter and endurance systems of the last game are the most noticeable. I love the idea of making resource management a part of dungeon crawling. If done right, it adds a new level of strategy to the experience. Although the last game struggled to implement it correctly, I still miss it. The new system, where food, empowerments, and wounds are the main reasons to rest, is okay. Needing to spend food might have been enough of a factor to make you want to avoid getting wounds, if higher difficulty would have made expensive food more desirable. As it is, resting is cheap and easy. Another issue with the new system is having all spells refresh each fight means you approach all fights the same. Before you were forced to use a range of abilities or rest over time. Now I started every fight with the exact same priest buffs and used a much smaller range of spells throughout the game, which made combat more repetitive. Changes to ability selection and character advancement are mixed. On level up, the new interface looks far superior. It gives a much clearer indication of what abilities are available and when, while also being far more approachable for new players. The big drawback is you get a much smaller amount of abilities to use in combat. By making it a choice between passive or active abilities, while also making all abilities refresh after each fight, it makes sense to only select a small amount of active ones and focus more on passives. This results in less choice in battle, and having to choose between active and passive abilities in the early game can often feel like being forced to choose between fun versus useful, which sucks. Later in the game you'll have more abilities, and there's also less passives worth buying, so the problem goes away a bit, but unfortunately so does the difficulty in the game, making it a bit meaningless. There were problems with the old system. When you picked up Heravius halfway through the last game and you have 40 different druid spells you now need to learn, it feels like a bit of a chore. But I do miss having so much choice in combat. The best spell system was the wizard in the first game, where you had some limitations in battle but a large selection outside of combat and freedom to change things around easily. Of the new spellcasters, wizard is still the best, as it gets the most free spells. Although speaking of wizard spells, the need to retrain when you change Grimoire is pretty big, and even if there weren't bugs with retraining, it's still a huge time sink to just change 1 or 2 spell choices. Druids and priests feel like they have too few options early game, and it's disappointing to have lots of interesting spells in the game and only being able to use 1 or 2 per tier. Cypher is even more limited. There is still an impressive amount of choice when you level up in the game, and with lots of new abilities it feels like the class system is full of potential. Before moving on to writing and story, it's also worth looking at dialogue from a gameplay perspective. After all, you spent hours in this game sitting in dialogue. I think ratio-wise this game is even more dialogue heavy than the last, although that could just be the result of voice acting. Still, I'd love to see how long each game's entire script is for comparison. While dialogue is light in gameplay, effort's been made to make your choices feel like they have greater consequences through party reputation and the returning disposition system. The party reputation system is shallow and rarely involves choice on the player's part. Characters have more positive triggers than negative, so to raise your reputation with them all you really need to do is have them around and not deliberately provoke them. The disposition system is more of a problem. Apparently it's also bugged, although I'm not sure how much of the problem is because of an actual bug and how much is just poor balancing that there wasn't time to fix before release. The result is gaining disposition is way too easy. You end up capped in appropriate dispositions in no time, which isn't that bad. The problem is it's almost impossible not to pick up 2 points in dispositions that don't reflect your character or your actions. This is a big problem because it seems you only need 2 points to trigger responses in conversations based on dispositions. I saw a couple of 3s, but I don't think I ever saw a 4, which begs the question of why does it even go up to 4 ranks, and why didn't they raise the amount needed for conversation triggers? That alone would have helped. As it stands, NPCs comment all the time based on you having things at rank 2, even if you have the opposite disposition maxed. Why does the system not work like faction reputation, where it's a scale that has an overall combined rank that weighs each side? Instead I had people constantly commenting on how cruel I am for having 2 ranks in it, despite the fact I had 4 ranks in benevolence. This happens all the time and it's both immersive breaking and annoying. It even happens in some important scenes. It was kinda sad to finally meet Canna again and have him act all surprised by how cruel I had become since he knew me, despite the fact I hadn't done anything cruel throughout the entire game. Attempts have also been made to make it feel like your own character build influences conversation, through a range of increasable secondary skills in addition to the normal stat checks. It's a good feature and the expansion of it's welcome, although it's so easy to make your watcher have high secondary skills for every single thing through party member contribution that it loses that personal feeling a bit. Writing plays a big part of a CRPG just based on the fact that there's so much text in these games. Obsidian is meant to excel at writing, and the quality of their story, character and world building are often cited as factors that are meant to make up for their shortcomings in gameplay or excuse the presence of bugs in their games. I think writing is an easy thing to criticise and a hard thing to do well, but I also think there are several problems with the writing in Deadfire, a lot of which weren't problems before, and I think it's worth at least highlighting these. I will say I don't think this game is terribly written, but I do think it could be a lot better. Some of the issues with the first Pillars of Eternity have been addressed. There is less exposition and a lot less lore dumps. This is mostly because of a glossary feature that is returned from Tyranny, and it works really well. The writers don't need to explain each term directly, just in case the player hasn't been paying attention, and it even allows the use of some made-up fantasy dialect to be inserted, which surprisingly doesn't feel too unnatural and even adds to the world building. Although in the case of the Valians, I'm not sure it counts as made up when you just take some Italian words and change a couple letters. Companions are more mixed, with some very noticeable problems. I guess since they added the reputation system, the writers were told to play up those identified characteristics more. The result is they feel a lot less realistic and can often feel like they've been reduced to a few stereotypes, particularly the returning characters.
Alright, I'll go first. Is it true some of your kind are covered in soft fur that feels good to pet?
Is it meant to be funny when a deer comments to remind you he wants to pet animals? Like, I know dude, that's your only defining characteristic at this point. You don't need to keep reminding me, I haven't forgotten. Still, a deer was never a character with much depth, and Alof was bland before and still is here, which I guess at least shows consistency. Pallegina is the most egregious of the three. I have no idea what happened to her, and I think if she didn't have the same voice actor, she would seem like a completely different character. She used to be serious but seemed competent, loyal to her country but not to the point of going against her own moral compass, as shown in her previous companion quest, at least not without serious encouragement from the Watcher last game. She was cold to others but not antagonistic. Now Pallegina is a brainless cheerleader for anything to do with the Valian Republic or Animancy. Anytime they are mentioned, she has to interject about how wonderful they are because that's all her personality is now.
The Republics have the best minds in the world pursuing it, Mestre Alvari.
Well, that and being an edgy atheist that gets offended at any mention of gods.
Little woman making a big noise. When someone takes that tone with me, what follows is not conversation. In the Republics, no one would bat an eye if I cut you from gut to gullet and left you holding your innards in a ditch.
Even if you do still like the returning characters, it's hard to justify there's a point to them, because except Pallegina, they have nothing to do with what's going on in the world. They don't have any new character development either, and you learn nothing of interest about them. You just go over familiar ground, and it feels like a wasted opportunity.
Exactly, you understand. Wait, how's that?
The new companions are slightly better because at least their personality feels like they've been designed to tie in more closely with the reputation system. Jyoti's childishness was probably supposed to make her endearing, but it feels out of place amongst the seriousness of the world.
She started it!
The most annoying part of this is that you have no option to talk to her about the gods, nor anyone else for that matter. But the gods were created by the Engwithans was the most important thing you learned in the last game, and all your old companions commented on it at the time. Now though, it seems your character is keeping it a secret, or something, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's fine that you don't tell everyone you meet, but not having the option to tell an apparently close companion whose entire personality and story revolves around her god is odd. It would have been a much better way to include some character development instead of just deciding what to do with the souls in her lantern. As it is, her childishness is grating and her development is weak.
You need me, I'll be 2 whoops and a holler away.
Seraphin is okay. The amount of times he mentions how much he likes sex and how often he gets laid makes it seem like he's overcompensating for something.
You would have to be large enough to grab his attention, I say.
Oh, I'll be big enough, lad. Where it counts.
Other than that, there's not much to him, except for some reason he seems to get really annoyed anytime slavery is mentioned. Almost as if he has some personal connection. Wow, what a big surprise when you find out what that is. I bet you didn't see that coming. Maya's fine, except for her eagerness to sleep with you minutes after meeting, and with the amount of other people you seem to run into who she's already slept with, I guess that's normal for her? Her quest at least felt like it had some development though. Really, all the companion quests are pretty weak, often feeling like they end prematurely. But they weren't very good in the first pillars either. I think the biggest difference that makes them disappointing in Deadfire is that you don't get to feel like you've had much influence on the characters when the end scenes play out. Before you got to shape their growth quite a lot, whereas now faction choice seems to play a bigger role, and while you still affect their outcome, it's less direct or involved. And then there is Takehu, who manages to make both Seraphin and Maya seem prudish. Everywhere you go, even remote and distant islands, there will be some NPC who he's slept with, and everywhere you go, Takehu seems to want to make some sexual comment on something for some reason. It's almost like he has an agenda to make sure you always know just how aggressively sexual and openly bisexual he is. Or at least the writers do, as it feels like a big part of Takehu's role in the game is to make some kind of political statement.
To be between lovers is a terrible thing, unless one is physically between them, I say. Captain, I would speak plainly. Are you as excited by the possible? What I mean is, if we were to...
And that's a shame, because Takehu is the best character out of your companions, even if the constant sexual comments feel very forced. He has actual development, and you get to play a role in it. He also has the best interjections during dialogue with NPCs. No, not the ones relating to some innuendo, but his comments on the Juana and their culture. He actually adds an interesting perspective on several things you encounter. The comments your companions make during dialogue in general feels like a good addition, as it makes them feel like they are more involved with what's happening, even if it's mostly just to remind you that they have an opinion on something relating to their reputation, not to provide an actual interesting insight. The amount of sexual references in this game is a bit much.
Best thing I ever heard aside from a man's moans in the air.
Did you know when you... Oh! We were discussing Benny's rapturous fingers. Not mine.
There are loads of NPCs who for some reason want to sleep with my character, or just tell me how much they like sex, and options to flirt are everywhere in the dialogue. The game feels like it's desperately saying, look at how mature and adult this is, there's references to anal beads and naked men in the bathhouse, and it all feels a little embarrassing.
Because that's the other thing that's really appealing about it is, it's not just a fantasy setting, it's something that we can put the sort of mature themes and topics into it that we've always wanted to.
Is this what Josh meant? Is that what he always wanted? Or did someone just decide sex sells, so we have to have as many references to sex as possible? It wouldn't be so bad if the writing was better, but it's not. It can be pretty cringy.
All the powers of the Deadfire have their eyes on the Watcher of Cadnua. Tell me, is the Watcher watching anyone?
He tips his head coyly to the side, letting his hair drape down with a moist squish. A moist squish? Is that supposed to be appealing? Who'd write that? A lot of times it feels like I've walked into someone's crappy fanfiction, and that's not a feeling I think the writer should be trying to emulate. Anyway, talking about things that are cringy and seem like fanfiction, this game also adds romance. I only checked out Jyoti's romance, and I'm not sure why I did that, other than curiosity is powerful even when you know better. It's bad. Really bad. Painfully bad. First option, kiss her, okay? Second option, lean in close and make a fart noise into her ear. What? I don't know who would write that, and I don't know how it could then go on to be included in the game. Is there no quality control for this writing? All I know is it makes me cringe, and no game should make me feel this embarrassed on its behalf. The flirting in general is terrible, and it's often so out of place. Why do I have the option to touch Soti's face not long after meeting her? She hasn't made any advances towards me and we've just met, it's a bit creepy. And then there was the option to hold Takehu's hand and say, it'll be okay, I'm here, after seeing the Raparu cast members being treated badly. It sounds so incredibly patronising. It's a serious moment and the way it's written just seems so inappropriate. The game is full of these moments. But you know, maybe I'm just a miserable and jaded person. I never like romance in games between player characters and NPCs. I think they're always terrible. But talking about miserable and jaded people, I seem to remember a certain post from Josh Sawyer about romance, which he stood by later on a number of occasions as well. I don't hate love in game stories, I just hate reducing love to shallow masturbatory fantasy indulgence. That seems a bit strange in retrospect, because Deadfire is everything Josh apparently hates when it comes to love in games. You want to see ego stroking, just look at how desperate almost everyone is to sleep with your character in this game for no reason at all. Romance here is pure masturbatory indulgence, with a fade out to implied coitus even. Funny how Josh goes on to say harem anime is gross pandering, because at least that stuff's honest about what it is, and sometimes even self-aware. Romances in RPGs are guilty of the exact same sins, and Deadfire perfectly exemplifies just how bad it can be.
When you touch me like this, even through my clothes, I can feel it hot as a brand. I'd sear your name over my heart, Watcher, if you'd only let me. But other parts of you feel just as hot, or hotter even. Bet I'd like to find out.
There's also companion interactions. I enjoyed my companions arguing in Baldur's Gate, except for the time when Corgan got upset and stormed off leaving me a man down at the start of the Underdark. Anyway, I get why they wanted to include this, but I only actually saw one interaction, and that just happened to be as soon as I put Palagina into my group for the first time. I literally moved one loading screen and her and Jyoti started arguing, with Jyoti even saying it's her or me. Nothing actually came of it as a result, but it's still jarring having this trigger instantly. In general, companion interactions don't seem that well implemented, but they also make the already childish characters feel even more like kids.
Souls and gold and glory. Blame the Dawn Stars, for they have summoned me. And now,
take me
I must feed.
From this point onwards there will be spoilers, so keep that in mind if you keep watching. Your companions may be annoying children, but there's another group who's even more annoying and even more childish, and that's the gods. The way these deities are handled within the narrative is one of the weakest parts of the game's story. For starters, these are some of the most unimpressive gods I've ever come across. Except Eophas, they feel completely powerless and useless. How are they not able to stop Eophas if they wanted to? Margaret alone stopped him before, and now you have almost all the other gods united in wanting to stop him, and all they do is sit around chatting, sometimes telling the player to hurry up. Also, they're so unthreatening. It doesn't help you could have already betrayed them before and seen the almighty ground-shattering consequences of having birds shit on your boat. Their unimpressiveness is only surpassed by their unlikability.
Magrin looks at you as one might a wayward gob of spit on one's shoe.
It is no business of yours what the gods decide.
Really, these gods want me to do what they say, and how do they act? These gods want something from me. Why are they always insulting me and looking down on me? As if I'm gonna do what they want when they treat me this way. Are they meant to be idiots because they just seem dumb? Don't they consider that I would be more likely to help them if they ridiculed and insulted me less? It feels like the writers are trying as hard as possible to make you dislike the gods, which makes the grand decision the series seems to be moving towards pointless because no one's going to be pro-gods after playing this game. And can we take a moment to appreciate just how dumb looking Hylia is? What is that face? Also, I didn't expect Margaret to be an edgy looking flaming black dude. It's a bit weird. Andra kinda looks cool at least. I mean, a fish head and 4 breasts is exactly what I look for in a woman. However, her personality is awful. This doesn't seem at all like the Andra of the last game. She used to be smart and articulate and cold. Now she's been reduced to an overprotective mother who's obsessed with her child Takehu, and even has a temper tantrum if you break up with him.
You hurt him. You hurt my boy.
It's pathetic. Still, if there is one thing I really hate about how the gods are portrayed in Deadfire, it's how any and all mystery surrounding them is gone. Mystery played such an important part in the last game. The whole narrative revolves around trying to piece together multiple bits of information and events to work out what's going on. And while it didn't appeal to everyone and it had its own problems with its execution, I can't believe how little mystery there is left in the world of Eora. This game certainly had nothing going on to be unsure about. Maybe you didn't know what Eophas was going to do, but only a little way into the game you can chat to Eophas and he happily tells you, so that doesn't last long. Even Whale, god of mysteries, has no mystery to him. You know what he looks like and sounds like, and after interacting with him, you know he's just a pointless simpleton.
Are we to keep nothing for ourselves? Not a single secret retained? Not a solitary mystery?
WoW demands, their voices steadily rising.
Although you have to sympathise with him, as at least he understands the problem. Everything about the gods is disappointing to me, but the writing of dialogue responses during every interaction with them really doesn't help. This game is so full of snarky or sarcastic quips that try so hard to be humorous, and when talking with the gods you encounter these non-stop. Some people may like this, and I have no issue with a game not taking itself seriously, or using humour, but one thing that's very important is the overall tone and achieving a level of consistency. This is a game that sometimes takes itself extremely seriously, with fancy prose and attempts at philosophical subjects. When the game is saturated with lines that read like they were ejected from a Marvel movie, it undermines the seriousness. I'm not saying there should be no humour, just sometimes it's better to let a serious scene be serious, to give it actual weight. And the far more light-hearted approach this game takes also feels a bit disconnected from the overly dark and bleak first game. It's all a bit jarring. A lot of dialogue options in Deadfire felt very unappealing to me. I just wanted to play it as a serious but also self-centered character, and that didn't seem to be an option usually. Often I just said nothing, even when there were plenty of choices, because none of them felt right to me. It's a bit sad. The writing isn't all bad though. There is one place it shines, the setting, and the world building and factions that take place there are all really strong. The Deadfire archipelago is a hell of a lot more diverse than the Deerwood. Pirate or Islander settings aren't that unique. There's been other games, and the Disney movie, and a Pokemon installment, all doing the same thing in the last couple years. Still, they do a great job at making it feel big and believable. I wanted to explore even with the zero difficulty gameplay just to see what's out there. Of course, Nekataka is the crown jewel of the Deadfire in more ways than one. The city's fantastic. Lots of gorgeous locations, a great size, and I love how the map adds to the immersion by giving it a real sense of scale and believability to travelling around it. The old city was my favourite part of the entire game. It's really a dungeon done right, and it's soon enough into the game for the difficulty to still matter. Being left all alone down there with no way back and having to fight your way out really adds to the already intimidating atmosphere. The boss fight was also the only challenging part of my playthrough. It took me many tries and was very satisfying to finally kill. If I have one overall complaint about the setting, it's that it's a little safe for what was promised. I'd have liked more danger juxtaposed against the idyllic and inviting locations. Also, where the hell are the Polpavir? How can you make such an enticing book entry about monsters of a Deadfire and then not include them? I hope they're going to show up in the DLC at least, or it'll be really disappointing. As well as the general setting, the factions are also a huge improvement over the first game. The colonial aspect of the setting is generally handled very well, with each faction feeling surprisingly balanced. The Huana are not merely meek victims whose hospitality is being taken advantage of. The Queen and her brother show a lot of wisdom, strength and pragmatism. What's more, the downside of their culture, the heavy reliance on superstition and an oppressive caste system, is shown alongside the good traits. Both the Valians and the Rautaians' influence on the region is shown in good and bad ways, and each also has its own admirable long-term goal, that of utilising animancy in the case of the Valians or stopping the storms for the Rautai. They do engage in shady stuff, like supporting the slave trade or assassinating innocent tribal leaders, but they also can have positive influences, as shown in Sakuya and Tikawara. It would have been easy just to portray the colonizers as purely bad, and the natives as purely sympathetic in an attempt to make some real-world political point, but the writers avoid this temptation, and the setting feels more interesting as a result. The factions also have a lot of good quests, with interesting reasons for doing them, and often with multiple ways in which they can be completed. There is a clear problem with how the factions connect to the main story, however. They feel unrelated from each other for most of the game, which makes the game feel mixed thematically. It's when they finally do start to play a part in the main story that things get a bit shaky though. For starters, this scene where Aldis turns up at the palace in Neketaka is terrible. The idea of one of the most wanted pirates just walking into a heavily guarded palace is ridiculous, and the conversation that then takes place is written really badly.
Now everyone just calm down. I promise we won't fire on you at this time, unless firstly provoked. That is, until once we've safely absconded from the city back to the high seas. Then all bets are off again, aye?
There was no need for Aldis to turn up then. She could have just sent a message that you got afterwards. But it seems the writers felt they had to bring everything together in one conversation. Once this scene is over, you're close to finally deciding on a faction to support. Although for some reason the arrival of an actual world-threatening event makes each faction suddenly only care about fighting each other, which is a bit weird when they somewhat tolerated each other previously. Before playing the game, I was worried that when it came to picking a faction I wouldn't care, as none seemed very interesting to me. To my surprise, I'd come to like the factions overall, and was happy to commit to siding with the Royal Deadfire Company and see what would come to the region under their dominance. However, then I got to the final quest. Other factions had pretty tame quests, it seemed. Get a ghost ship for the Principe, sabotage the Royal Deadfire base for the Valians, and so on. What did the Rautaians want? For me to go kill the Queen, who was one of the only NPCs I liked in the game and who had done nothing wrong. And while I'm doing that, they're going to shoot the hell out of Queen's birth and maybe hit a few Valians while they decimate the local population with their superior firepower. I mean, what? It's a terrible plan. Why do we have to kill so many innocents, and the Queen? The Queen's been pretty cooperative, how will killing her help? So I had to say no, which you can do for every other faction just fine, except the Rautai, who don't let you say no and attack you instead. So then I load a previous save and go it alone. If I can't help who I want to without going fully evil, then I guess I'll go alone, and hey, the Rautai seem pretty competent, maybe they'll do okay without my help. So off I go, sailing away, saving the world, and who turns up to attack me in the final fight of the game? The Rautai, what the fuck? You have 3 dialogue options, but none of them stop them attacking me. I like these guys, I want to give them Ukaizu, I want to help you conquer the Deadfire. Why are you doing this to me? Why can't we be friends? Is this my punishment for liking the imperialistic faction? Are they meant to be the bad guys and I just didn't realise? So, that was a bit of a slap in the face, but maybe it was just to prepare me for the much bigger slap in the face that was coming from my big old boy in blue, Eophas. I guess the writers really wanted the watcher to live up to his name and just watch, because you play no meaningful part in the ending. I mean, you can tell Eophas to kill you, and he does.
If you seek rest,
or you can go full edgelord and tell Eophas to kill the world, and while he thinks this is a dumb idea, he then goes and does it anyway, accidentally. Oops. Apart from that, you don't shape the events and you don't get a choice in what to do. You don't even get something to fight. The last game's ending was full of choices. You decided what to do with the Avara, you decided how to handle Chaos, you decided what your companions make of the God revelation, which shapes their future. You decide which god to make a deal with, and you decide what you're going to do with the souls, and this time around, you just watch. The ending gets worse the more you think about it. What was the point in the entire story? You set out to stop Eophas, you go to Ukaizo to stop Eophas, then you get there, have a pleasant chat, and then Eophas does his thing anyway. So there was no point to your journey or this entire game. I think this might be a problem of wanting to make a sequel and then forcing a story into a setting, while only really caring about how to set up the story for the next game. But the whole Eophas thing really is just there to set something more interesting up for later. I mean, if the Watcher had stayed dead for the entire time, what would have changed? Eophas could have destroyed the wheel in the opening cutscene even, and then we could have just jumped right into the planned sequel. What was the point in making a direct sequel anyway? It can't have helped sales, as people hear about a story-heavy game with a prequel they haven't played, and then they're less likely to play Deadfire. We could have had an indirect sequel that continues the story of the world but with a new main character, and a main storyline completely focused on the Deadfire region. The end result could have still been the wheel breaking and the gods being sent into turmoil, but I'm sure with more freedom the story could have got to that point in a more interesting way. A sequel could have been set up just as well, but the gods could have stayed more mysterious and powerful. The difficult to import consequences of the first game, like betraying the gods, wouldn't have needed to be addressed, and new players would be more likely to jump in and try it out. You could have even used the mystery of what is the Watcher of Caed Nua up to help build hype for a sequel, a bit like in the Knights of the Old Republic. Pillars of Eternity 2 is a sinking ship, but it's not sunk. I'm sure Obsidian will fix the largest of its issues, the balance and bugs, but I don't think they have a valid excuse for why they existed in the first place, not to this extent. I think there are a lot of missed opportunities in the game, and a lot of things that I hope will be improved in the future. I still had fun playing it, but if the difficulty was a bit more balanced, my time with the game would have been so much more enjoyable. I still love the world Obsidian has created with the Aura. I hope the future's bright for the series, and the genre, and for Obsidian, but I'm not sure it will be. This game presented an opportunity to prove to the market that a real-time with pause, isometric CRPG can have a big budget and be a success. Even without the bugs, it failed at doing this. The sales don't seem good enough. I don't want to be overly dramatic, and I really don't know what the exact situation is, but I think it's safe to say the game hasn't had as strong sales as was hoped. They seem to be less than the first game, and that makes sense as some people won't want to play a sequel, and the novelty of an Infinity Engine style game isn't going to be as strong now as it was at the release of the first Pillars of Eternity. Still, I don't think this game has been anywhere close to being a financial disaster, and I think Pillars of Eternity 3 will very likely still be made. I'm not sure it will have quite such a large budget, but I think that's okay. A lot of the voice acting could be removed. The engine doesn't need any improvements to still make a great looking game, except maybe an optimization. There's no reason they can't make a great CRPG with a lower budget, and learn from their mistakes in Deadfire as they tried so hard to do with the first game. If there's one thing that worries me, it's what audience Obsidian is trying to make a game for. It feels in many ways that with Deadfire they decided they needed to make changes to broaden its appeal, and tried their best to capture the modern BioWare audience. They added gameplay features like AI mode, put in romance, changed the writing style to be light-hearted and heavy on humour, and focused their limited development time on everything except making the game balanced for players who enjoy a challenge. The truth is, some of the changes I dislike, others will love, and I can't really say it's wrong for Obsidian to make a game for those people instead of me, even if I wish I could. What I will say is I hope Obsidian make the game they want to make going forwards. You can't make everyone happy, but not many game developers get the luxury of a loyal fanbase and the financial safety net that crowdfunding provides. So take risks. Stop trying to appeal to everyone, don't add things you don't want to add even if they boost sales, and don't give in to fans even when they scream loudly. What matters is making something great. Do that and people will forgive almost anything, because no matter how specific people's demands are, that's the only thing they truly want in the end. There's a darker future as well, that those fans of old CRPGs who still cling to the nostalgia of a long over era continue to get milked by the crowd-funded craze. But developers continue to use titles like Planescape and Baldur's Gate as a means to get easy funding while putting out games that are a shell of their namesakes, or just unfinished and buggy. Deadfire had so much potential, and 2 extra weeks of development would have made all the difference in improving the experience for many players. I'm not sure the future does look all that bright, but I'm also not giving up hope yet. If this ship really is going down, then I guess I'll be going down with it. I mean, it had its moments, and I still intend to see it through to the end.
Nemnock hopes your boat sinks. Bird lady pretty. Hello, bird. Fishman smells terrible.